As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast gems.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency. Make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. On this members-only episode, we ask ourselves about outliers. We'll meet one, actually. In fact, she's a juggernaut, not just an outlier. She's a lady who becomes a force of actual nature. As with everything and everyone, however, there must be a starting point, and as for Matilda of Canossa, her starting point comes in the form of her father. This is Patreon episode 16, entitled Duke Bonifacio of Canossa. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all the support. I hope you enjoy the show. Full transparency. As I put this narrative about Matilda of Canossa together, I admittedly use Michelle K. Spike's book, Tuscan Countess, The Life and Extraordinary Times of Matilda of Canossa. In fact, I'm not ashamed to admit that I was completely blown away by this book, actually. Spike's retelling of Matilda's life is second to none in terms of someone who not only attempted to remind us all today about this extraordinary medieval woman, but also someone who wanted to truly know this lady. Spike immersed herself in Matilda's world the best she could some 900 years later. She walked the same streets as Matilda. She touched the same stone walls as Matilda. She visited the places Matilda once called home. Every page of this book drips with detail. And despite the amount I may quote Spike's work, I highly recommend everyone listening to grab a copy of their own. Spike did a spectacular job, in my opinion, and it was her book that almost single-handedly opened my eyes to, I say again, one of the most extraordinary women of the tumultuous 11th century. Before we jump into the story full bore, let's just see the impact of Matilda of Canossa, what impact she left on the world. She lived an exceptionally long life, to be sure. She was born in 1046, but she wouldn't pass away until July of 1115. For those who know their medieval history, we haven't begun to scratch the surface on world events that occurred during Matilda's lifetime. Sure, we've mentioned the somersaults England was pushed through, from the near civil war between King Edward and Earl Godwin, to the Danish and Norman and Norwegian tug of war over the mighty island kingdom. But outside of England, these are the days of El Cid in Iberia, the southern Normans raining down hellfire across Italy and Sicily, even imprisoning a pope, mind you. Don't forget about Poland, though. As you know, as a supporting member, don't forget about Poland making its bed east of Germany. But the Kievan Rus coming into their own in the riverlands at the far eastern edges of Europe. Constantinople, seeing its best days disappearing in the rearview mirror. Matilda of Canossa's life straddles all of these things, and it's an absolute tragedy that she's been overlooked by historians. So kudos to you, Michelle K. Spike. But she wasn't forgotten by all. Spike writes the following: holding a crucifix to her chest, Matilda prayed. She prayed, quote, "Always, as long as I lived, I placed my hope in you, O Lord. Now that I've arrived at the end, I pray you, purify me of my sins, and turn to me your face that saves." At her death, Matilda was laid reverentially in the tomb waiting for her at the monastery. In accordance with her last wishes, the monks agreed to celebrate a special mass on the anniversary of her death and in her memory to distribute food to the poor on the first Monday of every month. They did so faithfully for the following 5 centuries. End quote from Spike. Let me repeat that last sentence, if I may. Quote, "They did so faithfully for the following 5 centuries." End quote. Over the next 500 years, that is, the monks of the monastery of Bondeno, Italy, a town that history has erased from the Tuscan landscape, mind you, fed the poor on the first Monday of every month without fail. Rounding it all out, that's roughly 6,000 Mondays that these monks, at the behest of a dead woman, fed the poor in the area. What kind of person has that kind of effect on people over such a long period of time? Well, I can think of a handful, but it doesn't stop there, though. Her legacy, that is. Spike tells us, quote, "Matilda is one of only 5 women whose bones lie within 100 yards of the Apostle Peter's." End quote. See, in 1635, Pope Urban VIII was already widely respected and feared across Christendom. He had made some serious moves already by making tobacco punishable by excommunication when on sacred ground, and by being the last pope to have militarily expanded papal boundaries. In fact, just 2 years earlier, Pope Urban VIII's trial against Galileo Galilei as part of the Catholic Inquisition had concluded, and Galileo, at the Pope's direct orders, was stuck at home, unable to leave for the remainder of his life. See, in 1635, the newly constructed Basilica of St. Peter was ready to be furnished with decorations and relics of saints, and Urban VIII was well aware of the bones of the 11th century lady, Matilda of Canossa, in Bondeno, again a small village at this point. It was quickly fading away, if not for a local monastery that again still fed the poor once a month. Urban VIII was a proud Tuscan himself, and he was well aware of the story of Matilda of Canossa. He ordered the monks in Bondeno to donate Matilda's bones to the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, which is funny because as a Catholic, wouldn't the definition of charity be kind of obvious? Either way, Urban VIII had already proved that he wasn't someone to be defied or denied. So after the monks there, who had taken care of the Tuscan countess for centuries already and honored her dying wishes, refused him, well, Urban VIII gave them an offer they couldn't refuse, literally. See, the monastery was struggling mightily for money at the time. As I said, it was a dying town around it. Pope Urban VIII knew this, and he leveraged that fact. He sent 2 priests to the monastery with a personal letter to the abbot there, which basically said, "You will either pay this fee or give us the bones of Matilda of Canossa." The abbot had no choice, which is how Matilda's bones ended up in Rome, where they still lie today. So what's the big deal about Matilda anyway? A clue is found on the inscription that is carved above Matilda's new forever home in St. Peter's Basilica. Spike tells us it says, quote, "Urban VIII, Holy Pontiff, translated the bones from the monastery of San Benedetto in Mantua of the Countess Matilda, a woman with a virile soul and champion of the Apostolic See, known for her piety, celebrated for her generosity with eternal gratitude and merited praise in the year 1635. End quote. Virile soul, champion of the Apostolic See, piety, generosity. As we know, epitaphs are tricky. They're kind of like social media in that they only focus on the good sides of people. They highlight only those things that shed the most positive light on a person. They leave out all the morning arguments with their kids, all the tears shed over, former lovers and friends, all the sleepless nights we spend agonizing over situations or personal failings. I'm by no means saying that this epitaph for Matilda of Canossa was a lie or even a stretch. Hardly. She may have very well been all those things. But as we know on the podcast, people are hardly the two-dimensional epitaphs and biographical accounts we have available to us. I'm thinking of a recent one we just covered on the main podcast of Romanus IV Diogenes. And speaking of biographical accounts, those centuries ago were only really written about by those wealthy enough to commission a learned monk or priest to write one for them. And you, the benefactor, well, you would have been the ultimate editor of your biography. Matilda of Canossa commissioned a priest named Donizoni to write what would become known as the Vita Matildis. What I admire about both Spike and Donizona are how neither of them tried to kid themselves about the Countess. As Spike says, quote-unquote, Matilda was one feisty lady. She compares the Matilda she came to know on her travels around Matilda's Italy as a statue as opposed to, say, a frieze. That is, a three-dimensional Italian woman of wealth and influence with a little military kicker on the side, rather than a two-dimensional, warmed-over character in the background of a largely forgotten 11th century Tuscany. It's a wonderful comparison, and I hope I do the Countess justice as I narrate her story on both the public and these Patreon episodes, like this one. Spike writes, quote, As I peeled back crust after crust of pious legend, I found myself in touch with a woman as vulnerable as she was ruthless, and of an intelligence superior to that of all her peers, save one, Hildebrand, or Pope Gregory VII. The spark of attraction between these two intellectuals ultimately cost him his papacy, an issue curtly acknowledged by papal historians, but never explained. And the paradoxical undercurrent of her bellicose life is that she endured every danger, every privation, and every hardship because she loved him. End quote. Now, did you catch that? What may be the smoking gun as to why the likes of La Grande Contessa, the Grand Countess, Matilda of Canossa, being overlooked or forgotten throughout history is her rather intimate, dare I say, romantic relationship with the firebrand Cardinal Hildebrand. Now, Hildebrand was behind some monumental activities and events, as we know from earlier episodes on the main podcast, including his fueling the fire of the reforms brought about by Pope Leo IX. Remember, it was a young Hildebrand who accompanied Leo IX from France to Rome, barefoot, to show his reverence for the papal throne prior to becoming pope. Hildebrand was a juggernaut, and I'm not just throwing that word around, willy-nilly on this episode. Hildebrand was a juggernaut in his own right, and when he became pope in 1072, he would usher in some of the largest reforms in papal history, from the Great Schism of 1054 to the investiture controversy, from mediating between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV at her castle to the First Crusades. Matilda of Canossa was somewhere in and around a stretch of history that would arguably define the next 1,000 years of European history. Now, one last thing to mention about Matilda before we get into her story or backstory on this episode. Spike mentions two things, two historical markers when the world was one way one year and was a completely different way the next year. She mentions the Cambridge medieval history text marks the end of the Dark Ages as occurring the same year that the early Italian commune movement officially kicked off in the cities of Florence, Lucca, Ferrara, Mantua, Modena, and Reggio Emilia. The year was 1115. If you remember from a few minutes ago, the year 1115 was also the year that Matilda of Canossa passed away. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. What if I said that those cities I mentioned, Florence, Lucca, Ferrara, Mantua, Modena, and Reggio Emilia, well, these were all cities under the direct influence and authority of Countess Matilda. Still just a coincidence? So we're right back to a fundamental question when we begin learning about any historical figure. Who was Matilda of Canossa? Well, if you ask Matilda herself, as evidenced by her direct influence on Donizoni's biography of her, and the early mentions of classical authors like Virgil, who wrote the famous story, the Aeneid, Spike writes, quote, "Her tale rivaled the fall of Troy and the founding of Rome." End quote. Hyperbole? Probably, but I wouldn't say it was hyperbolic by much. Now, as I said, Matilda of Canossa was born in the year 1046 in the town of Mantua, a locale in northern Italy. She came from a prominent Lombard family who can trace their lineage back to the 980s. Mantua, in name and culture, still thrive today in northern Italy. Spike tells us, quote, "Virgil claims that Mantua was founded by a child of the river god Tiber, who named it after his mother, the prophetess Manto." End quote. Originally, this city was founded on an island in the middle of the Tiber River, but it, of course, began expanding across to the main shores on either side into what we have come to accept as Mantua, the Mantua we see today. One of my notes in the margins of Spike's book reads, quote, "The city of Mantua was very different in Matilda's time than it was even 80 years after her death." End quote. But culture ebbs and culture flows over the centuries, but some things remain the same. For instance, our author tells us that today, in Mantua, fishermen, like old, still rake the riverbed with huge nets pulling in local delicacies such as eel, carp, and catfish. Also, horse meat is still offered in area restaurants. Now, as for the layout of Matilda's place of birth, there's more that remains the same, almost as a skeleton of its ever-changing silhouette. Quote, "Two piazzas, the small, intimate Piazza delle Erbe and the spacious, elegant Piazza Sordello, have been the twin centers of the life of this city since before Matilda's time." End quote. But Spike also continues, quote, "The ducal palace, the cathedral church, and the archbishop's residence line the Piazza Sordello in the same configuration as in Matilda's day, although the buildings have been much aggrandized in the intervening centuries." End quote. Now, Spike goes on describing Mantua in various seasons, from the water droplets on the streetlights to the fog, quote-unquote, playing hide-and-seek in and around the arched columns. Spike is a really talented writer. There's no question about that. I'm telling you, it was a good read. Now, this river island community, Mantua, in the year 1198, branched out to its shores on each side, as I said. But the people themselves, by and large, continued on as their forebears had for centuries. Logging and fishing were mainstays for Mantuans for seemingly ever. But where Mantua and thus Mantuan families, such as Matilda's, gained its wealth and notoriety was in trade. Specifically, the trade up and down the Po and Tiber river systems all seemed to find their way to this island port. River travel was extremely quick 1,000 years ago. Hence the domination of Vikings, for instance, who settled modern-day Russia and Ukraine, etc. So if you could afford a boat and had the means to push your way up and down a river, then you could make some decent bank in those days. Mantua was merely a convenient stopping-off point. Spike notes that merchants from Venice and Ravenna brought spices and fragrant woods and soft, colorful silks to Mantuans from as far away as China and India. Sicilian products such as sugar, citrus fruits, and cotton were found in the port town's markets, as well as northern European goods by way of Bavaria, which included furs, wool, iron, silver, tools, and various cloths. Mantua was a worldly city, though during Matilda's time it wasn't exactly seen that way. By the time Matilda was born, her father, Bonifacio, was changing Mantua's image. Bonifacio was a wealthy Lombard lord who ruled over many of those cities listed earlier, Florence, Mantua, Reggio Emilia, and the rest. He lived high in a hilltop city of Canossa, in a castle which overlooked the entire valley below. From his vantage point up there, he could see a handful of these cities and towns pockmarking the land as far as the eye could see. And the view was spectacular, as for all intents and purposes, it was a nearly full 360-degree view. However, at first, though Mantua fell within his borders, though just barely within his borders, it was run by a local bishop, and the city wasn't exactly doing much with its geographical bounty. So, in walks Bonifacio, who offered his services in coordinating security up and down the Po River and its tributaries, one being the Mincio River. The bishop couldn't possibly turn down such a move, as he recognized the move as one that would secure the city long enough to grow into its potential. However, Bonifacio was no fool, and he certainly wasn't a charity. In exchange, he required the bishop hand over the city and the surrounding lands to him. The bishop may or may not have wanted to cede power to just another Lombard overlord, but he knew the boon it would be for the people, and so he agreed. Now, was the acquisition of Mantua by Bonifacio a big deal in the grand scheme of Matilda's life? Certainly not. I mean, the story does set up how it came to be that she was born there. However, I say all that to merely offer an example of the person Matilda called father. It was Bonifacio who doted over his daughter and taught her some of what it took to be a strong, fearless leader, even if Matilda was a little girl. This story happened 12 years, the story of Mantua's quote-unquote rebirth under Bonifacio. This story happened 12 years before her birth. But it was things like this that she admired about her father, Bonifacio. She even had Donizone include the following about him. Quote, "As rich as Solomon and as wise, Bonifacio lacked nothing from the earth or from the sea." End quote. Spike wrote, quote, "He was a powerfully built man, tall and handsome, full of self-confidence." End quote. Another series of events that brought Bonifacio fame and glory before he ever even married Matilda's mother came when a collection of dukes coaxed Bonifacio's younger brother, a man named Conrad, who was described using many of the same adjectives as Bonifacio in terms of military prowess and physical stature. Well, they pressured the young Conrad to rise up against his older brother and claim the family's inheritance. But Conrad defied the powerful dukes and took to the battlefield alongside Bonifacio. Spike writes, quote, "The brothers," Matilda says, "fought together to quell the envious duke's rebellion. Quote, their horses' hooves were red with blood as they rode down those who turned their backs and attempted to flee the massacre of beasts and men. It seemed to their enemies that Bonifacio's lance was 1,000 arms long and the width of Conrad's 100 cubits." End quote. The two brothers, Bonifacio and Conrad, defied multiple powerful knights and their armies, and they emerged victorious in the most ruthless way. A clear message was sent north that Bonifacio was not to be trifled with. However, this battle brought upon the family a grave injury. Spike continues, quote, "At battle's end, Conrad noticed a thin line of blood on his own breastplate. His wound never healed, and he died after much suffering. Donizone reports that Bonifacio carried his brother's body and laid it in the sepulchre at Canossa, his figure as tragic as Achilles mourning over the fallen Patroclus. Ever after, the dynasty, including Matilda, viewed the family crypt on top of precipitous Canossa as their private Valhalla." End quote. Conrad died a warrior's death for the glory, essentially, of his older brother. These are the very things legends are made of, and it's no small wonder that Donizone, at Matilda's behest, fills the pages of her Vita Matildis with imagery and wording harkening back to classical antiquity. In that, the Vita Matildis serves a special place in the conversation for these quote-unquote ancestral works of the Renaissance. After his little brother Conrad died, Bonifacio would gain the attention of another Conrad, that of Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. He would ride alongside the emperor. Bonifacio would ride alongside the emperor and earn considerable distinction in the view of Conrad II, who awarded Bonifacio vast wealth, sure, but something else far more valuable to a northern Italian knight. Bonifacio was awarded the Duchy of Tuscany and the title, obviously, of Duke. Now, in 1034, Conrad II called Duke Bonifacio to his side once again to deal with the bellicose Burgundians who were causing trouble along Germany's southwestern borders up in the Alps. Bonifacio once again did not disappoint, and had praise and wealth heaped upon him and his men at battle's end. Though Bonifacio was widely acclaimed as a preeminent soldier written about in almost the same tone as those pesky Normans throughout the 11th century, he wasn't entirely what we'd today refer to as a valiant and chivalric knight. These were, I should say, the days before any precursor to the chivalric code, which would be established in Europe. Once an instance of this anti-chivalric knight comes just after his and Conrad's glorious defeat of the Burgundians in late 1034. Spike writes, quote, "Men from a nearby town crept into the Lombard camp one night and made off with several horses. Bonifacio set out to avenge the theft, taking only a small company of 30 lancers. The townspeople, hearing the savage Lombard horns, fled, but were quickly captured and imprisoned. To teach them a lesson, Bonifacio ordered their ears and noses of every man in the town cut off, filling 3 shields with refuse cartilage." End quote. On this point, I absolutely agree with Spike. It's stories like these that absolutely refute the modern interpretation of medieval women simply waltzing into positions of power. See, 1,000 years ago, women were not legally allowed to take the field of battle. In fact, it was specifically against the law to do so. Couple that with the fact that in order to be given any political region of your own by your king or emperor required one to be able to provide military support when called upon. That in and of itself is a major barrier for women of the day to find themselves in a position of power. It wasn't illegal to hold such power, but it was illegal to make the moves to obtain said position of power. If they can't lead an army, because they can't be on the battlefield, and the whole purpose of getting some sort of landed notoriety, some title of note, is to be able to provide that military, well, that's the workaround that women had to figure out in that day. As Spike says, quote, "Matilda knew that the road to the top of the heap ran over other people's bodies," end quote. And who taught her that lesson? Her father, of course. Matilda, by way of Donizone, continues her description of her beloved father when she described how he came to marry Matilda's mother. Quote, "Bonifacio rode north to fetch his new bride, Matilda's future mother, with an entourage of riding horses trapped out with silver and shod with silver shoes affixed with silver nails. Crowds followed them to collect the trail of silver left by the horses as they thundered through the streets and fields." End quote. If there was an 11th century top G, Bonifacio may have been it. This lady he was coming to marry was named Beatrice of Lorraine. She would be a second wife to Bonifacio, but it was Beatrice who would steal his heart. Bonifacio had already lived a long life for the time. He was over 50 years old by the time he married Beatrice, while Beatrice was maybe 20 years old. By landing this lady, Bonifacio was punching way above his weight class, by the way. Bonifacio and Beatrice were wed, however, only after Bonifacio had earned exceptional military praises by King Conrad II himself, who happened to be a direct descendant of the legendary Charlemagne, as well as Beatrice's kinsman. In fact, kinsman makes it seem like he was some distant cousin or something, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. When Beatrice was a child, her parents both died. Her mother's sister, Giselda, was the Queen of Germany and Conrad II's wife. So Beatrice was taken in by Aunt Giselda and raised in the halls of German royalty, like the heart of German royalty. Keep in mind that Conrad II had been named Holy Roman Emperor already, just 3 years prior to this marriage. Bonifacio of Canossa was now directly linked with the Holy Roman Emperor. Bonifacio was no joke, but neither was Beatrice, and neither would be their daughter, Matilda.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtual Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your virtual pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
As Bonifacio and Beatrice partied over the course of 3 days when they were first married, no expense was spared. In fact, no expense was spared for his new wife and the family he would provide them when he constructed a new estate in Mantua itself. There, Beatrice would bring Frederick, Beatrice, and Matilda into the world, a son and 2 daughters. And it would be this final child, Matilda, who Bonifacio would treasure the most. Spike writes, quote, of the 3, only Matilda would prove to share Bonifacio's instinct for survival or his iron constitution. A beautiful girl, slim with pale white skin, Matilda had a tender face crowned with a mass of shining golden red hair. She idolized her father and later remembered being his favorite, lavishly pampered and totally adored. End quote. This estate that Bonifacio built for his new family was on the island itself, the island of Mantua, and it was located at the very tip of the island, overlooking on 3 sides the river and its unnavigable ancient adjacent marshes. Strategically, it was the safest on the entire island, the easiest to defend and to scout potential threats. Heading in toward the city, Bonifacio built what Spike called the quote-unquote administrative center of the entire city right outside of his walled estate. A church with a bell tower, of which the bell tower still stands today, a bishop's home, and a tax collector's home were all around a central piazza right outside of his front door. The church, however, was the focal point of the entire piazza and became a rallying point for generations of Mantuans thereafter. And it was this very church that we can directly credit for the physical place where Matilda's spiritual setting would take root. Her family, both father and mother, were deeply religious as well. In fact, all of Mantua and the surrounding northern Italian cities under Bonifacio's purview were deeply Catholic. In body, mind, and heart, these were deeply Catholic people. And in such a community of true believers, events like this would be embraced. See, In 1044, when Matilda was just 2 years old, she walked beside her mother through the piazza toward the monastery on the other side of the city. They were in a procession of innumerable Mantuans, and they were all following one man, a blind monk named Adalbert. Spike narrates it like this, quote, "They marched from the cathedral to a spot in the monastery's garden where an angel had revealed to Adalberto the hiding place of the town's most precious relic. About 150 years earlier, a vial of the precious blood of Jesus had been buried by Benedictine monks to save it from the Hungarian hordes overrunning the city. None of the monks survived, and the location of the precious relic was forgotten." End quote. A piece of artwork by some unknown painter survives to us today regarding this tiny, insignificant event in a tiny, insignificant town in the middle of the Po River. The canvas shows Matilda's mother, Beatrice, looking down in awe at the site, where there in the dirt lies the vial of the Savior's blood. No one knows exactly where this specific site of the dig was, but strong local tradition has it that Matilda built the Rotunda of San Lorenzo, which still stands today, around the site of the dig. In 1046, when Matilda was just 4 years old, King Henry III of Germany, son of the late Conrad II, made his way to Canossa to shore up support for his play on the title of Holy Roman Emperor. See, in order to become the Holy Roman Emperor, one must first become the King of Germany, the King of Italy, and the King of Burgundy. Then, and only then, can one appeal to the Pope to grant the king that title of Emperor. Henry III needed the support of as many dukes as he could get because, well, he wasn't exactly very popular inside or outside of Germany. Over the previous few years after his father Conrad II died and left him the kingdom, Henry III quelled the northwest of Germany not by mitigation or mediation, but by sheer force. He seized fortresses, stole the rights to silver mines, and broke up baronies to the effect that his dukes and counts and marcheses despised him. There was one situation that became pretty testy for King Henry III. It involved his splitting of the Duchy of Lorraine. When Duke Godfrey of Lorraine died, his son, also named Godfrey, was set to inherit the domain and swear his allegiance to King Henry III. However, Henry had other plans. Lorraine was to be the largest domain split by royal decree, and the younger Godfrey didn't take too kindly to his king's decision. In fact, Godfrey was so outraged that the man sent to assume control of the other half of the duchy was brutally murdered by Godfrey's own hands. The army of soldiers, who swore allegiance directly to Henry III, by the way, were slaughtered to the last man. Duke Godfrey didn't stop with Henry's army either. Godfrey swept up the Rhine River and destroyed every last village and town that held direct royal allegiance. This rather serious uprising ended in 1045, a year that Henry III's visit to Canossa, by the way. It ended in Duke Godfrey of Lorraine being detained and thrown in a German dungeon. As he approached Canossa, Spike tells us, King Henry III sent a messenger ahead of the massive German army to Bonifacio. Interestingly, she writes that Henry was quote-unquote asking for a taste of the celebrated vinegar made at Canossa, the same dark brown viscous balsamic that chefs today find so delectable. Produced only in this small region of Italy, its rarity then, as now, resulted from an aging process in cured wood casks. Thick, nearly black, vinegars of 50 to 100 years old are so prized for their perfume and concentrated sweetness that they are apportioned from eyedroppers. End quote. Bonifacio gladly sent the messenger back to the king with a few samples. But as Spike enlightens us, it turns out that Bonifacio sought to impress the king by creating a pure silver vinegar cask to hold the vinegar and a pure silver ox cart to hold the cask itself as it made its way up the river. This grand display of wealth and power played into Bonifacio's favor quite well when Conrad II was the target. However, Henry III was a different person altogether than his father. See, Henry had married the granddaughter of the founder of the monastery at Cluny. Now, if you remember, Cluny was the site of the reemergence of a more humble and solemn practice of Catholic monasticism. And Henry seemed to be caught up in the Cluniac fervor. So when one of his dukes carves out a brand new silver cask and ox cart to carry it, well, he's not that impressed. And he's also not very happy. As Spike says, quote, "The new generation of royals maintained a most curious court, more attended by monks from Cluny than by military men," end quote. Unsure why Henry III's response back was lukewarm at best, Bonifacio doubled down and surprised the king with, quote, 100 splendid brown horses with saddles, stirrups, and bridles, and 100 falcons that already molted, and another 100 that had not yet molted. End quote. Again, Henry III responded with a sigh and an eye roll, but it simmered there for a while, needling the king. Why, when he already controlled so much of Central Europe from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, why would he be so bothered by one of his vassals being so rich? He was clearly generous with it, and he had a history of remaining deeply loyal to the German crown. So what's the issue? Well, there wasn't one at first. Henry simply continued his trek down the Po River toward the Tiber and into Rome, where the new antipope Clement II, Henry III's own choice, was waiting to crown the king Holy Roman Emperor. This, of course, happened, and when Holy Roman Emperor Henry III was making his way back north up the Tiber and Po rivers, he knew he would have to pass his clearly too big for his britches Duke of Tuscany's land. And here is where the chess pieces began arranging themselves. Still confused, Bonifacio found himself in an impossible situation. He received word that Emperor Henry III would like to see the Duke in his personal tent, in the camp set up, just north of Mantua. Clearly, Henry was none too pleased with Bonifacio, so if Bonifacio followed the orders of his king now emperor, then he would most assuredly be detained. However, if he defied his king now emperor, well, that was an act of war. Spike writes, quote, "Divining the king's intentions, Matilda's clever father devised a plan. Gathering a force of 1,000 men, he made his way to the German camp by passing through the forest, not along the road. Every man was given a thick wax candle to carry on the tip of his lance. As the column of light approached from Mantua, it seemed as if the forest itself were burning. The vision terrified the king, who noted that Bonifacio was more powerful than he, and immediately returned north to Germany." End quote. Now this is when Bonifacio's story really morphs into Matilda's story. In 1046, as we've said, King Henry III of Germany was crowned Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. This same year was the year that Bonifacio stood tall and outwitted his king-turned-emperor, humiliating the man. Matilda was merely 2 years old at the time. But 1046 was just 1 year after what is called the Year of Three Popes. The Catholic Church, as we know, goes through waves of changing popes, sometimes as much as they change their own underwear. And the year 1045 was one of those exceptional waves that it seemed to happen all at once. Sylvester III, Benedict IX, and Gregory VI all wore those big fancy hats that year. But in 1046, by way of political manipulation by Henry III, Clement II took the place of Gregory VI. Clement II, again, was the hand-picked pope who crowned Henry emperor, which is to say that Gregory VI must have been against doing so, otherwise he wouldn't have been usurped. Now, Gregory VI still held major sway in Rome and across Christendom, as everyone knew what Henry III had done. While Pope, Gregory VI brought his young nephew, a clever, brilliant, and ambitious monk named Hildebrand, to Rome to begin his journey up the Catholic ladder of success. In 1047, Clement II died suddenly and without warning. Henry III chose Benedict IX as a replacement, but Benedict IX died within just 8 months of donning that pretty hat. Henry III needed a younger replacement now, someone he could rely on for a little longer than 8 months. So he chose an up-and-coming priest named Bruno, whom we've met on the podcast before. But see, this is where it gets a little tricky. Try to follow me here. Bruno would already be fast friends with Hildebrand there in Rome, and together they would push Bruno's election to the papal throne, as we mentioned earlier, as Pope Leo IX. That's right, the same pope who would, in just 7 years' time, excommunicate the Patriarch of Constantinople and cause the Great Schism of 1054. But it wasn't just that simple. When Henry III deposed Gregory VI, who was Hildebrand's uncle, that move alone, Spike reports, cost Hildebrand's family about 1,500 pounds of gold. That was a major blow to Hildebrand's family, a prominent family called the Pierleoni family. Straight up Godfather style here, man. The Pierleoni family didn't take kindly to this, and they helped get Hildebrand's best friend elected to the papacy, funding it directly and entirely. So, where does Bonifacio come into this whole situation between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope? Bonifacio married Beatrice, first cousins to Henry III, third cousins to the Pierleoni family, and, if I have it right, fifth cousins to none other than Hildebrand, making Bonifacio not only related to the Holy Roman Emperor, but also related to the family who held a grudge against the emperor who supported one of their own to the papacy. Beatrice was at the heart of it all. Now, Leo IX, as we know, would, as Spike says, stir up a hornet's nest. That's a quote from Spike. Stir up a hornet's nest in Rome. Long before he schismed Christianity, he attacked the long-held policy of simony, which is the selling of church offices to anyone, including non-clergy. The Cluniacs went bonkers when this happened, as that was one of the best things that Leo IX could have done. They loved him for it. In addition, Leo IX attacked the priestly practice of living with women and even forming families, so he decreed something that still holds true today, that clergy, from deacon on up to pope, were forbidden to have families live with women and girls, or even know the touch of a female. This rocked the Catholic world. We just take it for granted today, but 1,000 years ago that was not the case. This absolutely rocked the Catholic world, though the Eastern Orthodox cheered it on as they didn't really have a huge problem with that. The problem here was that, as Spike writes, quote, hardly a priest in Rome was not guilty of one or the other, or even both. If every guilty priest was deposed, there would be no one left to say Mass in the city of Rome, end quote. And it was in Mantua, with Bonifacio and Beatrice and Matilda in attendance, in the year 1052, that Leo IX would announce these reforms. Spike narrates the scene like this, quote, as soon as his discourse ended, a riot broke out in the pews. Like a horde of angry bees, the bishops chased the Pope out of the cathedral, fleeing across the Piazza Sordello. The Pope and his retinue of cowled monks barely escaped with life and limb to the safety of Bonifacio's palace, end quote. Boy, that's conveniently left out of the school history books, isn't it? Again, Matilda by this time, well, she was only 6 years old. Within just a few years, Matilda would learn to read and write Latin. She would ride horses pretty well, and she was fluent in German, Italian, and French. She was as worldly as they came in northern Italy in the 11th century. And her story, believe it or not, hasn't really even started yet. She was an outlier, if there ever was one. Later in life, she owned a rather large library of books and scrolls, from Christian theology to commentaries about the Gospels and letters of St. Paul. Her priest, who penned her biography, again, Donizone, simply referred to as docta, or learned, which Spike reminds us that was, quote, no casual compliment for a medieval woman, end quote. In addition, she would grow up to have friends, such as Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury, who would send her letters and even books to read. Matilda of Canossa, daughter of the Duke of Tuscany, was connected to the Holy Roman Emperor and the current Pope, whom he was at odds with. But, as a side note, she was also tangentially related to another important character in the history of music. Yeah. Her uncle, Bishop of Arezzo, sponsored a man by the name of Guido of Pomposa, the Benedictine monk who first created modern musical notation. Now, Bonifacio was larger than life, but sadly his story is only known through his daughters. Without Matilda rising to the heights she did, we may have never known anything really about Duke Bonifacio of Tuscany. He was heavy-handed, and he was brutal when it was necessary. He ruled his lands with little wiggle room for error, but the order he established and maintained throughout Tuscany kept the people there as safe as the mid-11th century could keep them. There were certainly mixed feelings about Bonifacio at the time, but one little girl knew exactly who her father was, and she adored him for it. On May 6th, 1052, the same year that Leo IX fled to Bonifacio's castle after his speech of reform, a local monk wrote in the annals of the monastery nearby, quote, 1052, in Italy lies the Marchese Bonifacio, wounded by an arrow on a hunt in the forest, end quote. Spike tells us that this assassin was never found. Now, as I tend to say on the podcast, cui bono? Who benefits? Well, that would clearly be the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, but he was already across the Alps back north in Germany. But an emperor's reach is long. I and many other historians, including Spike herself, I believe, can't help but point directly at Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. But sadly, Matilda's grief doesn't end there. She and her mother must endure 2 more deaths within 1 year of Bonifacio's. Her older brother Frederick and her older sister Beatrice. It was, as Spike says, quote unquote, calamity after calamity. What was Beatrice, widow and mother to only a daughter by the end of 1053, to do in such dire straits? Bonifacio's dukes were loyal, but they also knew that Bonifacio's iron grip had been released. Finally, Henry III now saw Tuscany as fair game as well, despite his close relations with Beatrice, his cousin. As I said, Matilda's story really starts with Bonifacio's support of Pope Leo IX and his close confidant, now Cardinal Hildebrand, even though she herself was too young to even remember such events. But it was the beginning of her impact on history, and what an impact it was. Until next time.